Hi everyone, so we are now on virtual lesson number 5 of the Concerto Through Time, and in today's lesson we are going to start looking at the transition and the change from Baroque into classical. So obviously it's still all under the umbrella term of classical music, but we have the Baroque period that we've looked at in detail now from 1600 to 1750, and from 1750 to 1820 musicologists and historians refer to this as the classical period. And so today, more specifically, our learning points are going to be what were the key stylistic changes and how did these affect the fundamental aspects of music, so melody, harmony and texture. And then we're also going to look at the changes in instruments and the instruments that were new, how instruments that were already existing had developed, and also the changes to the orchestra. As I discussed on my first video that I made, we use these dates with a pinch of salt, really, because obviously it wasn't like overnight in 1750 they suddenly said, do you know what, we're going to change how we compose music. There had been shifting ideas developing for quite a while prior to that, and similarly after 1750 there would still be some composers who preferred to compose in a style that we would consider to be much more Baroque, with these, their long interweaving melodies and lots of polyphony, things like that. But 1750 is generally a good marker. Sort of mid-century was a time when there were some real shifts going on and music was developing into something that sounded quite different. So there were two key reasons for this shift. The first was that in the middle of the 18th century, Europe was beginning to move towards a new style across the arts, so in architecture, literature, the arts, as well as music. And this was known as classicism. So that's where we get the classical period from. And the word classics, as I think I said in the first video, was actually because of its link to classical Greece. So if you think about the ancient Greeks, the Romans, it just became fashionable to look back at those periods and to celebrate sort of similar ideals. And rather than the Baroque period, which was very much about moving through all sorts of keys, long interweaving, overlapping melodies, what became stylish because of the influence of ancient Greece was form and division and clarity and structure, because those were sort of defining principles of ancient Greek and Roman culture. So all the sort of excessiveness and elaborateness of the Baroque period kind of became a bit OTT and sort of fell out of favour. Now, it's not to say that music wasn't still a high art form. It's not to say that music wasn't very sophisticated and could still not be very grand sounding, but it was just the way it was constructed really changed from this explorative, fussy, complex style to something that was much cleaner and had clearer divisions, clearer structures, clearer forms, an air of simplicity, but it was very elegant. Now, the second influencing factor on this shift was a change in the sort of economic order and social structure in Europe. So as the 18th century progressed, instrumental music's role really changed, and the general public started to become more involved in the musical world and started accessing music, and public concert halls started being built. So it went away from this sort of elitist high art form. And yes, whilst it was still sophisticated, the general public had access to it, and composers were also composing for different reasons. They weren't being commissioned by their patrons and working for the king or this, noble rich person. They were writing music, composing music for public events, for public concerts. And so they had to compose music that the public would enjoy. And because of that, music became a little bit lighter. Public taste generally preferred sort of more light-hearted, and as I used that word before, graceful, elegant, beautiful music, as opposed to this sort of heavy, complex, serious music that you'd had before in the Baroque period. So the social shift and the cultural shift meant that overall you really started to get quite a different style, and that became the classical period. So I really like this comparison picture of the two different types of columns. So the ones on the left were designed and built during the period of history that was the Baroque in architecture, which is actually slightly ahead of music. Art and architecture tended to sort of take on trends, and then music followed a few decades later. The left is Baroque architecture and the right is classical architecture, and you can see that difference and that division there. Okay, so as I said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into sort of three fundamental aspects of music and talk about how this shift had affected it. So melody, harmony and texture. So the first one we're going to look at is melody, and I'm going to play you an extract from another episode of the documentary by Howard Goodall on the story of music. And in this episode is called The Age of Elegance and Sensibility, and it's looking at the shift into the classical period. And at this point, he's been talking about the fact that some composers from sort of 1720, 1730 onwards were starting to write melodies that were not these long, unfurling phrases that were built from, a small motif, but then that would be repeated and developed and flipped upside down and back to front and layered, etc. But they would take their little motif, their idea, and they would play it once, and then they would repeat it, and then they would play something a little bit different, and then they would repeat it. So they were really starting to explore the concept of shorter phrase lengths and repetition. So it was making the music start to sound simpler. And then the first of the sort of great classical composers came along, and that was Haydn. And Haydn really revolutionized the concept of what you could do with a melody, and what was sort of one step better than just taking a short idea and then repeating it like little echoes straight afterwards.
Haydn took the idea of proportion and balance and went one crucial step further. His typical balancing phrase wasn't identical, but slightly different in character. It created a sense of symmetry without simply repeating itself. So in the exquisite slow movement of his 88th Symphony, Haydn's first little phrase of 6 notes goes like this. Its balancing second half takes the same shape but changes the notes, so it feels like it's on a continuing journey. Then a final part, equalling in length the first 2 bits together, rounds off the phrase in a satisfying and ornamented way.
Okay, so hopefully that's given you an idea of some of the differences between a classical melody and a Baroque melody. And as this slide here sort of summarises, the Baroque melodies would have this very small motif or idea that would be intricately developed in multiple ways within long, endless, unfurling phrases. And the effect of that was very complex. And the melodies sort of all together would often be overlapping, which created this polyphonic texture. So the classical melody was different because you would still have clear motifs that were simple, but they were more prominent. They were more a sort of short phrase in themselves, and they would often ask a question. They would sort of end unfinished sounding, as though they were waiting for some sort of response, and the responding phrase or the answering phrase would then come afterwards and would sort of neatly balance that first phrase. So you had these sort of little pairs of phrases that balanced each other, and this obviously fitted with the classical ideal of balance and unity and simplicity. And because of that, you also tended not to get overlapping melodies and polyphonic textures, because that just didn't really suit the aesthetic. It was much more about melody-dominated homophony, which is your clear melodic line over the top and the rest of the music supporting that in accompaniment in chords. Okay, so to go into a bit more depth on that, the idea of question and answer was really important. And when you are answering questions on the listening paper about an extract from the classical period, or when you're identifying an extract as being from the classical period, you've got to listen out for whether you have got long, unfurling, interweaving phrases, or whether you have got short question and answer phrases that sound balanced, because balanced phrases is a key term for what defined the classical period style of melody. And balanced phrases, question and answer phrases, are ones that you will have come across a lot of sort of very simplistic folk tunes and nursery rhymes, stuff like that, follows a similar sort of aesthetic because it's very pleasing to the ear. So on this slide, you've got Bar Bar Black Sheep. The first part of the phrase, da 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 da. Or that example actually is simpler. Da 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 da. But that sort of sounds unfinished. It sounds as if it's waiting for a response. And then the response comes. Da 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 da. And we finished on what's actually the tonic note, so it's the main key note, note number 1 of the scale, the key that you're in. We then do something a bit different, which is simplistic and repeated. Da 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 da. See, the rhythms are slightly varying, and then we repeat again that question followed by the answer. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. And so it neatly finishes it off again. So hopefully you can already sort of grasp that concept of it being balanced and of it being nicely structured and formed. And Haydn, developed that idea, but the composer who sort of came after Haydn, who was actually his sort of protege, was Mozart. And I'm sure you have all heard of Mozart, and Mozart is perhaps most famous of all for being an absolutely brilliant composer of melodies.
Mozart was a born, unstoppable tune writer. No one who's ever lived has bettered Mozart in this respect. It's like he couldn't help it. Tunes flooded out of him, seemingly at will. And that was important because Mozart, unlike, say, Bach 50 years earlier, was mostly writing for a paying public. If they didn't like his music, he'd starve. Ravishing melodies weren't a bad way to gain the public's heart, then as now. It pains me to say it, but if you can remember a tune, it's probably by Mozart. If you can't, it's probably by Haydn.
Poor Haydn. You should ask Dr. McPartland what he thinks of Haydn. He's pretty scathing. Haydn was brilliant and really revolutionised music at the time, but unfortunately he was just followed by some really, really wonderful composers such as Mozart and then Beethoven, who came next. So anyway, one thing I hope that you noticed when you just heard those little snippets of Mozart melody examples, some of which I'm hoping you might have recognised and been familiar with, even if you weren't quite sure why you recognised it, they're just melodies that are very popular and famous. One thing I hope you noticed is the fact that you didn't have crisscrossing, interweaving, overlapping melodies on top of each other. You had what sounded like quite a full orchestra and quite a full sound, but the main melody was prominent over the top of the texture and the rest of the orchestra was playing different types of chords, so maybe big block chords all together, or repeated, da 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 da, or sustained chords underneath, or maybe broken chords, but the harmony underneath, all the different parts of the orchestra were all doing something to construct a chordal accompaniment underneath, rather than overlapping different melodies. And so, as you should know, that texture is homophony, or more specifically, melody-dominated homophony. And this became very popular in the classical period because it allowed clear melodies to dominate, and obviously the texture was much less fussy, which suited the aesthetic. The accompanying orchestra would provide generally chordal support in harmony rather than overlapping melodies, as I've just said. So you've got a picture there of melody-dominated homophony with your little melodic line in red on top, and then you've got polyphony, which is all your overlapping melodies, one on top of the other. So that brings us nicely on to talking about harmony and how harmony had shifted, and the ideas around how to use chords in music had shifted in the classical period. So we know in the Baroque that music moved through lots of related chords, and Howard Goodall talked about the fact that the circle of fifths, which was a relatively new concept and way of organising tonality, the circle of fifths was very much used by composers to help move through lots of related chords. And he also demonstrated how you can use the seventh, which really leads one chord to the next. So the chord 5, 7 really leads to chord 1, and then you can move through these different keys. And music was explorative. We talked about, the ticking and turning of cogs and wheels and motion and all of that. So as we've been talking about, the classical period was about simplicity. It was about elegance. It was about grace. It was about balance. And so this concept of sort of moving through endless different keys and whirring and turning just didn't fit. And it also didn't fit with these melodies, these simple, balanced phrases. They needed simple, balanced harmony to go with it. And so classical composers really narrowed the spectrum of chords that they were using. So in a similar way to melodies, things almost, when you talk about it now, it almost sounds as if it's going backwards. It's becoming, it's becoming less, it's lessening, it's simplifying. But actually what was really happening was it was just becoming more refined and more elegant and giving better clarity. So your composer would choose the key they wanted to be in, and they would focus on 3 of the most important chords in that key, and those chords would dominate throughout. And so I'm going to show you an extract again with Howard Goodall, and he's going to explain to you how this new harmony worked in the classical period.
The most noticeable difference was a new approach to chords, the harmony that lay beneath every melody. Complication was replaced with simplicity. Unlike their predecessors, composers of the late 18th century decided there were really far too many chords available and that they needed far fewer for their purposes. They preferred a language that was much simpler. They were interested in great blocks of one chord followed by great blocks of another. Not only did they restrict themselves to a menu of half a dozen chords, there were 3 chords they used obsessively. 1, 4, 5. In the days when red, white and blue flags were being hoisted all over Europe, those colours are as good a metaphor as anything for these 3 chords. Let's look at an excerpt from an opera of 1762, Orfeo ed Eurydice by Christoph Gluck. It's a dance interlude that later came to be famous, called the Dance of the Blessed Spirits. Chord 1, the home chord, usually starts and ends a piece. Here's a score of that dance with all the chord 1s marked in red. You may be thinking that red is pretty powerful, but there are still some areas of the map not yet conquered by the Red Empire. OK, so let's show the same map with the blue chords added, eating up a bit more of the spaces that are left. The blue sections represent chord 4. Now you can see there's not very much unoccupied territory left. I'll mark in the chord 5s in white. So between them, our red, white and blue chords are all conquering. Nearly all of this music is either chord 1, 4 or 5. If I colour the final bits left in green, that's for all other chords, you'll see how tiny the remaining area now is, roughly a quarter of the music only. So the empires of red, white and blue had the world of music at their feet. This was still the case nearly 50 years later. Here's a piece from 1808 by Beethoven. In this stirring section, Beethoven harmonises the whole thing with just our 3 main chords. It's as if Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven were reading from the same very small book of chords. But having a simplified palette of chords didn't mean composers were unimaginative or bland. It's simply that their concerns were different. Composers of this period, like its architects, were obsessed with clear form and structure.
So as Howard was saying, there were really only ever 3 main chords that were used very frequently in whatever key you happened to be in a certain section of music. And that was chord 1, chord 4 and chord 5. And so this example shows you in C major what those chords are. So in C major, you've got chord 1, which is C, E, G, the triad. Then if you go up 4 degrees, 4 scale degrees, you get to F, and so it's F, A, C, that's chord 4, and then 1 step up from that is chord 5, G, B, D. And you can see all the different chords that you can create when you're in any one key or using any one scale. But 1, 4 and 5 are the most important ones. For those of you that have done theory in a bit more depth, you will know that in a major key, it's chords 1, 4 and 5 that are the major chords. The other chords are either minor or diminished, so they don't stabilize the tonality as much. And you can also see on this slide that you can use Roman numerals to depict these. So 1, 4, which is the I before V, and 5 is a V. And you can also see the names that we can give these chords. So chord 1 is the tonic, chord 4 is the subdominant, and chord 5 is the dominant. So subdominant, sub means below. And so subdominant is 1 chord below the dominant, which is 5. And you don't need to know the words tonic, subdominant and dominant for your exam per se. You do need to know that chords 1, 4 and 5 would be used frequently. And there is a term for those chords, and they are called the primary chords. And overall, you could say that in the classical period, composers favoured primary harmony. And that means that whatever key you're in, doesn't have to be C, obviously, whatever key, chords 1, 4 and 5 were used excessively, which meant that the harmony was very clear and relatively simple. Okay, so we've come to our final learning point for today's video, which is the change that affected the instruments in the classical period. And when we talk about instruments generally and how they're being used, we talk about instrumentation. And in the context of an orchestra, it's called orchestration. So orchestration is the use of instruments in the orchestra and the roles of the instruments in the orchestra. So this picture shows you a classical sized orchestra. This is obviously a modern orchestra in modern times. This is not, an old painting of a classical orchestra. But this is the Mozart classical orchestra. And so this orchestra plays only music from the classical period and plays on instruments from that time, and it's exactly the correct size. It's as it would have been back in the second half of the 18th century, start of the 19th. And you can see that there are lots of differences in this picture from the orchestra that you saw a couple of videos back when we had an example of the Brandenburg Concerto No. 4 being performed. Obviously, that was a concerto grosso, so you had your 3 soloists, your concertino at the front. But then if you think about the size of the orchestra behind them, it was really quite a lot smaller than this. So the orchestra grew significantly, and there were several changes to the roles of instruments. The reasons for it growing were that, firstly, instruments were being mass produced. So prior to that, in the Baroque period, every instrument would be carved individually by hand. So they were very rare, they were difficult to get hold of, particularly good quality ones, and not that many people had access to them. Whereas in the classical period, by this point, engineering had advanced so much that you had instruments being produced on a mass scale. And so more people had them, and more people were becoming musicians. It was also, being a musician was becoming more and more of a sort of noble profession to have. So you had more instrumentalists at your disposal. You also had this shift, as we've talked about, in the sort of social climate, where you had public concert halls and public concerts to perform music, and the audiences of the day, the general public, they wanted to see this music, they wanted to experience hearing an orchestra. And so if you've got a large public concert hall, you need to have a certain amount of musicians on the stage in order to fill the space. We haven't got amps and microphones at this point. So you had larger stages and larger orchestras, more musicians at your disposal, and so a bigger, richer sound. Now, the other thing to think about is the quality of the instruments themselves. So in the Baroque period, as I said, instruments were being handmade. We know from a previous worksheet and video that the woodwind instruments were made out of wood only, and we also know that the brass instruments were very simplistic compared to what they are nowadays. They didn't have slides and valves. They were just one long extended piece of brass tubing, and so the brass players had to use their mouths, or what's called their embouchure, to change the notes, and so that limited the amount of notes that you could play on a brass instrument. Trumpets couldn't play any note, they could only play certain pitches. In the classical period, engineering was not only increasing the number of instruments being produced, but it was drastically improving the quality of instruments being made. So brass instruments were starting to have valves, which is like the buttons, meaning they could play the full range of pitches. Woodwind instruments were starting to be made with metal keys. So if you think about an oboe or a bassoon, previously they were just like a wooden tube with holes in it that you would cover with your fingers, and so obviously that isn't as efficient a system as if you've got metal keys with pads underneath pushing down over the holes, which makes it really airtight. So the sound quality was much improved, they were easier to play, and string instruments were also improving significantly, as were the bows and the quality of the bows, which meant that the sound was richer and more pleasant. One thing that I think is really interesting is that violins and violas in the Baroque period didn't have a shoulder rest. They didn't have the little extra bit to go under the player's chin, or it's sort of slightly to the left of the chin under their jawline, which helps you anchor and hold the violin or viola in place. So without that, violins and violas were really difficult to sort of anchor to yourself. They would slip off your shoulder very often. And because of that, instrumentalists didn't have as much control, whereas in the classical period, they were being produced with shoulder rests and chin rests. And that meant that you could actually really firmly hold your instrument in place. And because of that, you could wiggle your fingers, so backwards and forwards, whilst pressing down the string to create vibrato. And vibrato, as we know from conventions of pop and looking at voices that have vibrato, vibrato is that vibration in the sound that makes it sort of wobble, and it carries the sound. So the quality of sound being produced by string instruments was significantly improved because they could hold their instruments more carefully and more easily, and therefore have greater control and the ability to create vibrato using their hand. So the addition of vibrato in the classical period meant that the music again would travel more easily, it would be richer, and you could fill a bigger space. The other thing you will notice in this example is that there is not a harpsichord player in the centre of the orchestra. There is a conductor with a baton. And I mentioned this on one of the worksheets previously, that Howard Goodall's video had a clip of a Baroque piece being played and he was conducting it, and that's actually historically incorrect because it wasn't until the classical period that you had conductors at the front, and that was because the basso continuo and this principle of having a harpsichord at the centre underpinning and structuring and anchoring the music together disappeared. It died out completely. There were two reasons for this. The first was that you didn't need this really stable, forceful key accompanying part in the music anymore, because you didn't have all these endless unfurling overlapping melodies. You had much clearer, concise, balanced, simpler melodies and phrases that in themselves didn't need to be anchored so clearly, and the most important thing was the melody. It wasn't what was underpinning it, it wasn't the chords underneath. You also didn't have the style didn't want to have that really fussy, ornamented, improvised harpsichord part underneath. The continuo part itself and the way it would be very elaborate, that wasn't really in keeping with the harmony and the texture, with mainly homophonic texture underneath the melodies. And the other reason why things changed was that the harpsichord in itself actually died out at the end of the Baroque period. And that is because the piano was invented. So the difference between a harpsichord and a piano is that, as we know, a harpsichord plucks the strings. So the mechanism means that it's always the same dynamic. There's no variation because the strings are plucked with equal force and the keys are not touch sensitive. Whereas the piano is introduced where you could press down on a key and the force with which you press the key down would mean that a hammer hit the strings within the instrument at the same force. So if you push a key down with a lot of force, push it down hard, the hammer hits the strings harder and the sound is louder. So pianos were touch sensitive. And obviously, as soon as this concept was invented, no one continued to make harpsichords anymore because pianos were so much better and so much more expressive. And we know that pianos were being introduced at the end of Bach's lifetime. So he's a Baroque composer. Bach actually died in the year 1750. And thereafter, in the classical period, you had pianos being introduced. And at first, they would accompany orchestras. There was a sort of gradual changeover. So, very early classical pieces might still have a harpsichord, and then that would be replaced by a piano. But then as composers were creating new music for orchestras and writing new concertos in the classical period, they no longer needed to have a keyboard instrument at all accompanying. So you wouldn't have a piano or a harpsichord at all. And what you did have instead was a conductor, because whilst you didn't need the driving force of the basso continuo bass line, you still needed somebody to kind of keep everybody together and mark out with their baton the speed, the tempo, so that everybody could stay in time, particularly as you had more instruments at once. So people, sitting right at the back of the orchestra, it's harder for them to hear what's going on at the front. You need somebody raised up on a podium, waving a stick, so you can follow the beat and not get too much faster or too much slower. The example here, you no longer would have a concerto grosso. That just died out. It just went out of fashion. But you would have solo concertos, and they were very popular, and they could be performed on a range of different instruments. So the soloist would actually stand at the front next to the conductor, and they would be positioned in such a way that they were facing outwards to the audience, and they were the main star. Everybody was watching them. They would be standing up, whereas the rest of the orchestra is sitting down, but they would be next to the conductor so that the conductor could obviously see them. They could turn their head to the left and see the soloist, but also the soloist in the sort of corner of their eye, they could also see the conductor's baton. And the soloist would lead the orchestra. The conductor would sort of follow the soloist, and they would sort of work in harmony with one another to make sure that the music flowed and all fitted together. So that brings us to the end of this video on introducing the transition to the classical period and some of the changes and shifts in music. And you've got a summary on this slide. You need to understand the meaning of balanced phrases or balanced phrasing, which is a question and an answer generally. You need to understand what primary harmony means, and therefore what melody-dominated homophony is, using that primary harmony underneath. And the influence and effect of concert halls and conductors, the fact that orchestras were bigger and better, and finally the demise of the harpsichord and the basso continuo part.